now. Yesterday, as you know, we heard from a distinguished panel of experts and former administration officials on the dramatic transformation that is currently taking place in Cairo, in Beirut, and beyond. There was general agreement on the need for the U.S. to send a clear signal of support to those freedom-loving Egyptians who renounce violence, who are committed to democratic governance, who respect the security and the sovereignty of all Egypt's neighbors. They were echoes of statements by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger from this past weekend that the U.S. relationship is not just with one person, but rather with all of the Egyptian people as a whole. Former Deputy National Secretary Advisor Elliot Abrams reiterated that Mubarak created the very situation that Israel and the U.S. now fear, and that Mubarak's statements that he will not run in Egypt's scheduled elections is too late to enable a smooth transition. America's role should be to facilitate a post-Mubarak transition in order to avert future violence and restore calm, and guard against the use of the transition process by nefarious elements such as the Muslim Brotherhood to directly or indirectly undermine Egypt's evolution to a democratic republic. There is no evidence that a well-thought-out contingency plan existed in the event that Mubarak's government became unstable or collapsed. The Wall Street Journal reported that Middle East experts at a January 31st meeting asked National Security Council officials, quote, "Please tell me that you have contingencies in case Mubarak's regime collapses," end quote. The National Security Council reportedly admitted there were no such plans. A February 2nd report by foreignpolicy.com cites a senior administration official telling ABC that the administration was being compelled to change its strategy every 12 hours. First it was negotiate with the opposition, then events overtook that, then it was orderly transition, then it was you, Mubarak, and your son can't run, and now it's the process has to begin now, end quote. Turning to the Muslim Brotherhood, New York Times reported on February 2nd that, quote, White House staff members made clear that they did not rule out engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood as part of an orderly process, according to one attendee, end quote. Engaging the Muslim Brotherhood must not be on the table. This also has implications for U.S. policy toward Lebanon, given statements last year by John Brennan, Assistant to the Secretary for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, describing Hezbollah's evolution from, quote, purely a terrorist organization, end quote, to a militia, to what Mr. Brennan refers to as an organization that now has members within the parliament and the cabinet. Has the State Department evaluated whether Lebanon now meets the statutory definition of a state sponsor of terrorism or terrorist sanctuary, given Hezbollah's control of that government? And what is the administration's stance on continuing to provide assistance to such a Lebanese government? From Lebanon to Egypt, what is the administration's stance on the Muslim Brotherhood? Beyond general parameters referenced in Deputy Secretary Steinberg's written statement that is in our packet, what are the specific components and contingencies of the U.S. strategy toward Egypt and for aiding in the transitional process? If a key U.S. goal is to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from taking over, and the Muslim Brotherhood is well funded, then shouldn't U.S. policy seek to shift economic aid away from the Mubarak government and focus it on strengthening responsible, peaceful, democratic voices? The administration's initial approach to Egypt was clearly not keeping up with the priorities. In its first years, while driving increases in the international affairs budget, the administration made significant cuts to total bilateral funding for democracy and governance programming. USAID even reportedly adopted a policy of only funding those organizations officially approved as NGOs by the Mubarak government. Repeated U.S. failure to enforce its own conditions and requirements on non-security assistance to Egypt has compounded the problem. So, Mr. Steinberg, what tangible economic or democratic reforms has the government of Egypt undertaken as a result of the billions of dollars that we have provided in non-security assistance throughout the last decades? What have we received in exchange? This brings to mind two lessons on the Lebanese debacle that we are currently facing. The first is that the elections themselves are meaningless unless they are supplemented with democratic institutions. Hezbollah's ascendance in Lebanon was facilitated by the failure of responsible nations to insist on changing a Syrian-dictated electoral law and subsequent regulation prior to holding elections in the aftermath of the 2005 Cedar Revolution. Clear standards for participation in elections and institutions must be both articulated and implemented to ensure that destructive actors are not afforded the opportunity to hijack an incipient democratic process. The second lesson is we cannot afford to continue to pursue a myopic, personality-based policy that relies on stability over institutional reform. In Lebanon, we had a short-term policy based on maintaining stability, and we invested significant political capital with both Rafiq Hariri and, in the wake of his assassination and ascendance of the pro-Western March 14th bloc, his son, Saad Hariri, basing the next round of election on existing Egyptian law and regulations without clear standards for participation and a democratic institutional framework is a recipe for disaster. And turning lastly to the role of the Egyptian army, it has been reported that the U.S. is working behind the scenes to impress upon the Egyptian military the need to protect protesters and support a peaceful government transition. And I will be asking you questions on the administration's view on this security assistance to Egypt. So thank you very much for being here. And I'm so proud and pleased to turn to my ranking member, Mr. Berman of California.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'm just getting word that probably a lot of people are getting, except